About a month ago, I did a video about trying to find the very first video game that let you defeat enemies by jumping on them. A quote-unquote Goomba Stomp. I'll put a link down below for anyone who wants to stop and watch that one first. For anyone who didn't immediately pause the video to watch a completely different one, let me summarize. When we tried to determine which game did it first, we came to a bit of an impasse. We had a lot of trouble finding an early game that had a Mario-style head stomp. In the end, we were either forced to accept that the obvious answer of Super Mario Bros. For the NES really was the first game to let you stomp on enemies, or that Joust did it a few years earlier. It all really comes down to whether you consider Joust's flappy style movement to be an actual jump or not. It wasn't the most satisfying answer. From the comments, it seemed like a lot of people were willing to accept Joust, but it didn't really feel like a solid example of the sort of action we were looking for. Lucky for us, the comments were also full of suggestions of other games that we needed to consider. 1Q34W pointed out a big hole in my search. By focusing on platformers, I had completely missed the top-down racing game Bump and Jump. In Bump and Jump, you score bonus points for bumping your enemies into walls. You can also destroy enemies by jumping directly on top of them. I really have to admit, I would never have thought to check racing games to find the earliest example of a Goomba Stomp. The top-down view makes it a little less clear. It doesn't really have the same feel as Mario jumping on a turtle, but I have to agree it's definitely a case of defeating your opponents by jumping on them. But is it a closer match than Joust? ZeroByte802 brings up the 1983 game Elevator Action. It's a spy game where the player must infiltrate a building, steal some secret files, and escape, all while dealing with waves of enemy agents. The player has a gun which can be used to shoot them, or he can make this jumping attack. ZeroByte points out that the game describes the attack as martial arts, and that makes it hard for me to accept it as a stomp. The game is definitely a contender, but this feels more like a drop kick you do by jumping into an enemy, and less of an attack where you have to jump onto an enemy. It's a minor difference, but I think it is an important one. Pow Puck Mobile and Hawks3992 pointed out the game Springer. And guys, I think this may be our missing link. Springer was released in 1982 by Japanese company Orca. Weirdly, it's actually kind of annoying to search for information about this game, as in a odd coincidence, there's apparently a famous orca named Springer, but I digress. In the game, you play as Springer, a rabbit who has to hop up a series of cloudy platforms, dodging dragons, to reach the sun at the top of the screen. Springer can kick enemies and jump on them to defeat them. The jump controls are a little awkward, but it's definitely a good old Goomba Stomp. I'm not sure how I missed this one. I had never even heard of it, and it never appeared in any of my searches or any of the many online discussions I read while researching this topic. It doesn't look like it was super popular, but it's also not some ultra-obscure title either. Orca made quite a few games, and Springer had both the arcade version and a port for the Atari. Yet, somehow, I just never came across it. So let's take another look at our timeline. Before, we had Joust in 1982, and Super Mario Bros. 3 years later in 1985. The arcade version of Bump and Jump released in 1982, Elevator Action comes out of May of 83, and finally our dark horse Springer also came out in 82. With 3 of our contenders released in the same year, we're going to need to be a little more exact. Bump and Jump was released in November, but Joust and Springer were a little tougher to nail down. Pretty much every source I could find for Springer just says 1982 with no month. Finally, IMDb, of all places, states that it's September of 1982, and with no other options, I'm just going to blindly accept it. Joust is listed on Wikipedia as being released in September of 82, but the Joust Master Wiki states the release date as July 16th of 1982. Remember when all your teachers told you that you shouldn't just trust Wikipedia and that you should look at the sources that it's using? Wikipedia cites the Arcade TV Game List Domestic and International Edition, a Japanese book written in 2005. The date for Joust is just part of a long list of games in the back, and the archive copy I found mentioned that there are known mistakes in it. Meanwhile, the Joust Master Wiki has an exact date and also mentions a 30th anniversary event held in July of 2012. So with all of that, I'm going to make the typical teacher move of declaring Wikipedia unreliable and go with the July date for Joust. So where does that leave us? Once again, we have two options. Springer is definitely the better example of a stomp attack, and it predates most of the other contenders. But once again, Joust is slightly earlier, and once again, it's going to come down to whether you count Joust's movement as a jump, and whether you count the collision as a stomp. Some of you were pretty accepting of Joust. Bill Cook, 4768, says, "When you first said Joust, my initial thought was, no way that counts. But the more I think about it, you may have convinced me." Crickew says, "I was gonna say Joust doesn't feel like a jump, but then your video showed it looking quite jumpy." NX Tangle says, "Games have double jumps and triple jumps. Joust has an infinity jump." But other people debated the jumpiness of this action. Besso3C says, "I wouldn't count Joust as having a jump. Each button press is a wing flap, not a jump. We wouldn't say that birds are jumping through the sky. On top of that, you're supposed to be jousting, not stomping on the enemy." Freaking Out on Audio says, "Since stomping still counts in Mario 3 where the tail has the same mechanic as Joust, then Joust counts as the first." And some of you took issues with the way the player actually collides with enemies in Joust. Jedi Yoshi 64 says, "The problem with Joust isn't about jumping, it's about the actual mechanic that defeats the enemy. Landing on an enemy from above does defeat them, but that isn't the point. The idea is that you try to have more height when running into them from the side, and the way it was implemented happens to also allow landing on them. I wouldn't count that. But if you do count any enemy beaten by landing on them, regardless of whether that's the intent, then Kangaroo did it earlier the same year." Skyden 24195 says, "Since Joust refers to the action as dismounting, and Super Mario Bros. Designates the action as a Goomba Stomp, I would have to go with the game in which the action is specifically defined as jumping on an enemy to defeat them. Joust more or less just dictates that whatever rider is at the higher level when contact is made, that rider dismounts the lower rider." Last time I argued for Joust, but after reading some of the comments and giving it more thought, I'm less sure now. The comments about the nature of the collision were especially convincing. Just a little bit earlier, I discounted Elevator Action's dropkick attack since it lets you attack from the side, and really Joust is pretty similar. So after careful consideration, I think I'm going to flip-flop and declare Springer as my pick for the first enemy stomping game. But what do you guys think? Has Springer unseated Joust? Should I have stuck with my first choice? Or is there some other game that we've all missed? Does this rabbit hole go just a little bit deeper? If you've got your own question you want to see answered, let me know in the comments. Big thanks to everyone who pointed out these games I missed the first time, and thank you all for watching this one. See you next time.